We have some sad news to share with you from the Fox News family. Dr. Isadore Rosenfeld, who created and for many years hosted the Sunday House Call Medical program, died this past week at the age of 91.
Rather than go to medication, try eating 1.5 ounces of dark chocolate a day.
Dr. Rosenfeld was called America's doctor because for years, millions across the country relied on his medical advice, his insight, his experience. But he was so much more, one of the most prominent cardiologists in the world. He was the Rossi Distinguished Professor of Clinical Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical Center, and he also practiced at Memorial Sloan Kettering. But his passion was tending to his patients as a general practitioner. And boy, do they include some of the biggest names in business and finance, showbiz, Hollywood, and so many more. But it was his caring concern, his humor, and his humanity that touched us all.
Medicine is not an easy profession. I'm not talking about the stress of the work, but if you care about your patients, every time somebody dies, you feel it.
You know, Dr. Rosenfeld believed in educating the American public about our health. As the best-selling author of more than a dozen books, medical editor at Parade magazine, and of course, spending his Sundays here with us to share his experience and knowledge with you. His son, Arthur, joins us now. Arthur, of course, our condolences and sympathies to you and your family.
Thank you very much.
Your father, he was a great man because he came here every Sunday because he loved it. Tell me about his love of medicine and of sharing his knowledge with everyone at home.
I think his love of medicine was a passport, a ticket. His MD degree was a document, a piece of power that allowed him to connect in the way that he wanted to. A tool, I guess is the word I'm looking for, to connect with people. He had great interest in people, great humanity and compassion, but he was genuinely curious about other people's lives and always looking to help in unexpected, creative, and profound ways.
At the age of 4, when I met my first doctor, and he had made such an impression on me that from that day on, at age 4, I was determined to become a doctor.
And he just wasn't a, quote, TV doctor. I mean, he did his own work, right? He wrote everything. I mean, tell us about that.
So I recently heard a story from one of the doctors who was attending him in the hospital in his last few days, that when this doctor was an intern and she had been looking around what hospital they have a matching program after they get out of medical school, where are they going to go and practice medicine. And she went to Cornell, and she said everybody was a little bit afraid of these interviews that prospective interns had at Cornell, because there was this great big bear of a guy who was so exacting in his interviews of these prospective doctors, so precise about their ability to make differential diagnoses. He was not probably a warm and fuzzy guy to be interviewed by. He wanted to have the goods.
He had his standards. He was exact.
Very exacting, very tough. And, that carried over into his writing, too, because, so many so-called celebrity doctors or attorneys or, specialists hire writers to do their work. But my dad did it all himself. And he was a hunt and peck typist, one finger, but he sometimes used speech-to-text programs and so on. But he did all his own editing, all his own writing.
You'd call him up on a Saturday night, or sometimes he'd be working at home from his study, writing what he wanted to say, researching himself, not with some big staff, because he loved it.
I think that's right. I think one of the balances that he found in the world, particularly as he got in the maturity of his career, was to balance the running around and seeing patients in the hospital and making, medical decisions, life and death choices on behalf of his patients. And then he balanced it by this time that he spent in his office at home. He had a beautiful library surrounded by books and wood panel, a nice bay window looking out on his property in Westchester County. And so he would look out at the snow or the spring or the trees, and he loved that room. He loved to look at that vista and to let these ideas about what he wanted to say to help the patients of America come through his fingers and onto the page. And I think a lot of those things were informed not only by his medical experiences, but also by people on the show who, wrote in and called in.
We had such reaction, as you know. For years, people would they'd call, they'd write in, and he'd answer the questions. And people have really reacted to Dr. Rosenfeld's passing, saying he helped me, he helped save my life, he stopped me and talked to me once on the street. And what always struck me about him was his knowledge, yes, and compassion, but his love of the general practitioner. And that, is this something, we would talk about this, that's missing in medicine or disappearing perhaps? He told the story once of a patient who saw him with a pain over the shoulder, and the guy went to dinner, and he was thinking about this patient, and he was out at dinner, and he called the guy on the cell phone, said, "Go to the emergency room right now." And his patient said, "What? Well, I'm at a restaurant." He said, "No, I want you to go right now." And it turned out that this patient had a potential ruptured aorta or something, which the pain was back here, but he knew through experience.
You get all the machines you want. You got to listen to a patient.
He was very much a cardiologist, and that was his primary thing. But I think what you're referring to is he had a real amazing intuitive gift for diagnosis. He just had so much experience and insight. This was just a special talent, that he could look at the same thing that everybody else looked at, and he would somehow see it a little bit differently and come up with a solution or an idea that other people didn't. And so he had a real genius for that.
And he also, not just in terms of his patients, I mean, the biggest names, as I said, in show business, and also would stop the guys on the crew, people on the street. He would always be willing to share his knowledge. Where did that come from? How did he?
So, I think he had great self-confidence that came from knowing what he was talking about,
yeah,
and being comfortable in his own skin. And that allowed him to hobnob with kings and princes and captains of industry and all the Hollywood people you mentioned, but, travel the world and in the company of politicians and policymakers. Early in our relationship, our thawing relationship at that time with Russia, with China, there are countless stories about him finding himself at a table with the people who ran the world. And it's, most people, I think, would be intimidated by those circumstances, but my dad was not. He knew who he was. He knew what he knew. He was a sharp guy.
And you come from an illustrious family, Camilla, your lovely mother.
That's right. My mother's father is a guy who arguably invented the field of exercise electrocardiography. He's the doctor that my father went to work for. That's how he met my mom, who came up first with the idea that if you stress the heart, it performs differently than it does at rest. And testing it under stress, you might learn something about it. So you could say that my grandfather invented the stress test.
That's amazing. And it was an enduring marriage of
61
decades.
years.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And finally, you're in a robe. Can you explain that? And then they'd say, why would a young New York kid from Westchester be
yes.
as a monk?
So I've been on this questing, seeking path since I was a young man. And it led me to the Eastern traditions of philosophy and religion and martial arts practice and other things. And eventually, I stayed on that bus so long that I was ordained a Taoist monk. When my father heard about this, I expected some comment, some eye rolling about how could a boy from New York become a Taoist monk. But actually, I showed him some video of me being ordained in China, and he watched it very intently. It was a YouTube video, and he said, "That's you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Over there, you went all the way across the world to do that?" I said, "Yes, yes." And I waited to hear what he was going to say. I winced, I waited. Sometimes he could be pretty pointed. And he said, "You're fantastic." It was a great moment.
That's wonderful.
He was a wonderful father.
We miss him. We loved him. Thank you for coming in. Of course, our condolences and thoughts to you, your family, Dr. Rosenfeld's wife, Camilla, sons Arthur, Stephen, Herbert, and your daughter, his daughter, Hildy. Dr. Isadore Rosenfeld, an original if there ever was one.
Thank you very much.
You will be missed, remembered with great respect and affection by us and by all our viewers who loved him and Sunday House Call.